Don't you dare touch me. The crack of flesh against flesh echoed through first class like a gunshot, silencing 200 passengers mid-conversation. The sound reverberated off the curved overhead bins and cut through the ambient hum of the Boeing 777 like a knife through silk. In exactly 43 minutes, the woman wiping blood from her split lip would shut down the entire airline and fire every crew member on this plane. But first, she had to survive the worst discrimination of her 20-year career. Before we witness this corporate earthquake that will reshape an entire industry, drop your city in the comments below. If workplace injustice fires you up the way it should, smash that subscribe button, because this story will leave you absolutely speechless. And if you've ever been judged by your appearance rather than your character, this one's for you. Now let's rewind to how this moment of corporate karma began. Dr. Maya Richardson walked through the sliding glass doors of Chicago O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 3 like a ghost in the machine. At 42, she was a phantom in the corporate world, a brilliant self-made billionaire whose private equity firm, Richardson Capital Holdings, had a reputation for aggressive takeovers and surgical precision in corporate restructuring. Forbes had dubbed her the silent predator, a nod to her habit of staying completely out of the public eye while executing massive acquisitions that sent shockwaves through entire industries. Her latest conquest was Apex Airways. The once prestigious legacy carrier had been hemorrhaging money for half a decade, plagued by outdated management, plummeting customer satisfaction, and a toxic corporate culture that treated passengers like cargo and employees like expendable resources. Just 72 hours ago, the ink had dried on a multi-billion-dollar deal that gave Maya a controlling 89% stake in the struggling airline. She was now the absolute authority, the new CEO, and the ultimate boss of every single employee wearing the faded blue Apex Airways uniform. But looking at her tonight, walking through the crowded terminal with a steaming cup of black coffee in her hand, absolutely no one would ever guess her true identity. Maya despised the pomp and performance of corporate theater. For her red-eye flight to London Heathrow tonight, her first official flight on Apex Airways since the acquisition, she had specifically bypassed the VIP private terminal and the exclusive Centurion Lounge reserved for high-tier passengers. She wanted to see the airline exactly as her paying customers experienced it. She wanted to feel every friction point, witness every service failure, and document every moment of truth that separated a premium airline experience from a budget disaster. To complete her undercover audit, Maya had dressed for complete anonymity and comfort. She wore oversized gray joggers that to the untrained eye looked like standard gym sweatpants purchased from a discount retailer. A faded Northwestern University hoodie, soft and worn from years of use, concealed a simple white cotton t-shirt underneath. Her natural hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail and covered by a plain black baseball cap with no logo or branding. She carried no designer handbag, no obvious status symbols, only a beaten-up Nike backpack that looked like it had survived 4 years of college and several cross-country moves. The December cold snap had Chicago locked in its icy grip, and the terminal buzzed with the chaotic energy of holiday travel delays, frustrated passengers, and overworked airline staff trying to manage the endless stream of complaints, rebookings, and baggage disasters. Maya paused near Gate 17. Observing the boarding process for her flight with the analytical eye of someone who understood that customer experience wasn't just about comfort, it was about revenue, reputation, and long-term sustainability. What she saw in those first 10 minutes of observation made her jaw clench with barely contained fury. The discrimination wasn't subtle. It was blatant, obvious, and so deeply embedded in the crew's behavior that they didn't even try to hide it. White passengers in expensive suits were greeted with warm smiles, immediate assistance, and deferential body language. Black and Hispanic passengers were met with suspicious glances, curt responses, and barely concealed irritation. The pattern was so consistent, so thoroughly ingrained, that Maya realized she was looking at a cultural cancer that had metastasized throughout the entire organization. Standing near the jet bridge entrance, checking boarding passes with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed the same task thousands of times, was Elena Vasquez. At 24, Elena was working the night shift to pay for her master's degree in business administration. She had dreams of moving into airline management, of creating change from within the industry. But tonight, she was just trying to survive another shift without incident. Elena watched the senior flight attendant, Victoria Hartwell, emerge from the aircraft cabin and stride toward the boarding podium with the confident swagger of someone who believed she owned the space around her. Victoria was 38, impeccably groomed, with platinum blonde hair styled in a perfect chignon and a uniform that had been tailored to fit her like a second skin. She had been with Apex Airways for 14 years, and in her mind, first class wasn't just a seating assignment. It was an exclusive country club, and she was the self-appointed gatekeeper who decided who belonged and who didn't. Victoria prided herself on being able to spot old money versus new money from 50 feet away. She harbored a deep, quiet resentment for anyone who didn't fit her narrow, prejudiced view of what wealth and sophistication should look like. To Victoria, luxury was about appearance, about brands, about maintaining the invisible barriers that kept the right kind of people in the right kind of spaces. Maya had studied Victoria's employee file during the acquisition due diligence process. 14 customer complaints over the past 3 years, all related to discriminatory treatment, all dismissed by middle management, who were too busy cutting costs to address cultural problems. Victoria's personnel record showed a pattern of microaggressions, selective service, and outright hostility toward passengers who didn't meet her arbitrary standards of acceptability. Tonight, that pattern was about to collide with the most powerful person in the aviation industry. As the gate agent announced the commencement of boarding for first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members, Maya shouldered her backpack and joined the short line of premium travelers waiting to board Flight 847. The passenger mix was typical for a transatlantic business route. Corporate executives heading to London meetings, wealthy retirees treating themselves to premium comfort, and a handful of passengers who had clearly used miles or upgrades to access first-class service. Maya took her place behind a businessman in an expensive Tom Ford suit who was already complaining loudly into his phone about delayed connections and demanding compensation from his travel agent. In front of him, an elderly woman in designer everything was instructing her adult son on proper first-class etiquette, her voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who had never questioned her right to occupy premium spaces. As Maya approached the aircraft door, she could see Victoria Hartwell positioned just inside the cabin entrance, her polite professional smile ready to welcome the passengers she deemed worthy of first-class treatment. Victoria's eyes were already scanning each boarding passenger, making instant judgments about net worth, social status, and belonging based on clothing accessories and racial profiling that she had perfected over years of unchecked prejudice. The audit was about to begin, and Apex Airways was about to fail spectacularly. When Maya stepped through the aircraft door, carrying her scuffed backpack and wearing what appeared to be discount athletic wear, Victoria's polite smile vanished instantly. It was replaced by a rigid mask of cold disapproval that she didn't even attempt to disguise. The transformation was so complete, so immediate, that Maya felt like she was watching a stage actor drop character mid-scene. "Excuse me," Victoria said sharply, stepping directly into the narrow aisle to block Maya's path toward the first-class cabin. Her voice carried no warmth, no welcoming tone, no professional courtesy whatsoever. She didn't say welcome aboard. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply raised one manicured hand like a traffic cop stopping oncoming traffic. "Economy boarding hasn't been called yet. You need to return to the terminal and wait for your proper boarding group." Maya paused, looking directly at the flight attendant, whose name tag read Victoria H. Senior Flight Attendant. The microaggression was immediate and obvious, cataloged instantly by Maya's sharp corporate instincts that had been honed by 2 decades of navigating discrimination in boardrooms, investor meetings, and executive conferences where she was often the only black woman in the room. I'm aware of the boarding procedures, Maya replied, her voice smooth and perfectly measured. I'm boarding with first-class passengers. I have a valid first-class ticket. Victoria's eyes swept up and down Maya's casual attire, lingering on the faded hoodie with barely concealed disgust. Her lip actually curled slightly, as if she had detected an unpleasant odor. "Ma'am, this is the first-class cabin," Victoria said, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to small children. "I think you might be confused about your seat assignment. Economy class is through the second set of doors past the galley curtain. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside so the actual first-class passengers can board without delay." Behind Maya in the boarding line, the wealthy businessman in the Tom Ford suit cleared his throat impatiently. Victoria instantly pivoted toward him, her hostile expression melting into a dazzling, apologetic smile that transformed her entire face. "Mr. Davidson, I am so sorry for this delay." Victoria gushed, her voice now an octave higher and filled with syrupy sweetness. "Please allow me to personally escort you to your seat and get you settled with a pre-departure champagne service." She turned back to Maya, her glare returning like storm clouds blocking sunshine. "Now please step aside so our premium passengers can board properly." Instead of arguing or raising her voice, Maya simply reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out her boarding pass. She held it up calmly, the printed text clearly visible to anyone who cared to read it. The ticket showed her name in bold, black letters. Richardson. Maya Doctor, followed by her seat assignment in first class, seat 2A, and the fare class designation that left no room for interpretation. First class paid. Victoria stared at the boarding pass, her jaw visibly tightening. She didn't apologize for her assumption. She didn't welcome Maya aboard the aircraft. She didn't acknowledge her mistake in any way. Instead, she snatched the boarding pass from Maya's fingers with unnecessary force, holding it up to the overhead cabin lights as if she were a bank teller checking a suspicious $100 bill for counterfeit security features. "Did you purchase this ticket yourself?" Victoria asked, her question inappropriate and completely unprofessional, or was it provided by your employer as a business expense? The implication was clear and insulting. Victoria was suggesting that Maya couldn't afford first-class service on her own, that someone else must have paid for her ticket, that she was somehow fraudulently occupying a space she didn't deserve. "I paid for the ticket," Maya replied evenly, her dark eyes locking onto Victoria's name tag with laser focus. She committed the name to memory, along with the employee number visible on the small plastic badge. "Victoria Hartwell, Employee ID 7749, Senior Flight Attendant. May I proceed to my assigned seat now?" Victoria. Victoria's lips compressed into a thin, hard line. The use of her first name by a passenger she clearly viewed as inferior felt like insubordination, like a challenge to her authority in her own cabin domain. She shoved the boarding pass back toward Maya with enough force to make the paper crinkle. "Seat 2, a left side," Victoria said curtly. "Try not to block the aisle with your oversized luggage." Maya nodded slowly, taking her boarding pass back with careful control. She walked past the hostile flight attendant and settled into the plush, wide leather seat of 2A, immediately noticing the stark difference between Victoria's treatment of her versus her interaction with the white businessman who was now being fawned over like visiting royalty. The audit had officially begun, and Apex Airways was already demonstrating exactly why the company was hemorrhaging customers and facing potential bankruptcy. The first-class cabin slowly filled with its typical mix of business travelers, wealthy retirees, and passengers who had clearly paid premium prices for premium service. Across the aisle in seat 1B sat Isabella Martinez, a 29-year-old travel blogger from Phoenix who had built a substantial social media following by documenting real, unfiltered travel experiences. Isabella had 400,000 Instagram followers and a growing YouTube channel focused on authentic travel content that went beyond glossy promotional material. Isabella specialized in catching airlines, hotels, and travel companies behaving badly, and her content had gone viral multiple times when she documented discrimination, poor service, or corporate malfeasance. She had her phone ready and was already filming her usual pre-flight content when she noticed the tense interaction between Maya and Victoria Hartwell. Something about the flight attendant's body language, the obvious hostility, and the stark contrast in treatment triggered Isabella's journalistic instincts. She discreetly angled her phone to capture the ongoing interaction, sensing that she might be witnessing something significant. In seat 3B sat Roberto Kim, a 45-year-old pharmaceutical executive traveling to London for a merger negotiation. Roberto had been flying business class and first class for over 15 years, and he had witnessed his share of discriminatory treatment by airline staff. As a Korean American who had built his career in predominantly white corporate environments, he recognized the subtle and not-so-subtle signs of racial profiling when he saw them. Roberto watched Victoria's differential treatment with growing discomfort. He had seen this pattern before: the warm smiles for white passengers, the suspicious glances for people of color, the assumption that anyone not fitting a narrow demographic profile was somehow an imposter or security risk. Near the forward galley, a young flight attendant named Marcus Torres was preparing the pre-departure service cart. At 26, Marcus was 8 months into his career with Apex Airways, working toward his dream of eventually moving into airline management. He had graduated from UCLA with a degree in hospitality management and genuinely believed that exceptional service could transform someone's entire travel experience. Marcus had noticed Victoria's hostility toward the passenger in 2A, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. He had been trained to treat every passenger with equal respect and professionalism, regardless of their appearance, race, or perceived social status. Victoria's behavior violated every principle of customer service he had learned in training and contradicted the company's stated diversity and inclusion policies. As Marcus began distributing champagne flutes and warm towels to first-class passengers, he made sure to approach Maya with the same respectful demeanor he offered to every other traveler. He approached her seat with a genuine smile and professional courtesy. "Good evening," Dr. Richardson, Marcus said, having read her name from the passenger manifest. "Welcome aboard Flight 847. May I offer you a pre-departure champagne or perhaps sparkling water?" Maya looked up at the young flight attendant, immediately noting the stark difference between his respectful approach and Victoria's hostile reception. "Marcus," she said, reading his name tag. "Thank you for the professional service. I would appreciate a glass of water if possible." Marcus nodded warmly. "Of course, ma'am. I'll bring that right over for you." As he turned to retrieve the water, Victoria's sharp voice cut across the cabin like a whip crack. Victoria snapped, marching over and grabbing Marcus by the elbow to physically steer him away from Maya's seat. "What are you doing, Mr. Patterson? In 4A is a platinum medallion member and he's still waiting for his coat to be properly hung. Focus on our priority passengers first." "But she just requested water," Marcus whispered, gesturing discreetly toward Maya. "It will only take a second to—" "She can wait," Victoria hissed, not quietly enough to avoid being overheard. "Look at how she's dressed, Marcus. She's probably flying on a buddy pass or using someone else's frequent flyer miles. We prioritize our actual paying customers who deserve first-class service." Every word carried across the quiet cabin. Maya heard the entire exchange, as did Isabella, Roberto, and several other passengers. The discriminatory language was explicit, undeniable, and completely unacceptable by any professional standard. Maya's expression remained calm and controlled, but her dark eyes hardened with the kind of cold fury that had dismantled hostile corporate boards and demolished discriminatory business practices across multiple industries. She placed a small amber prescription bottle on the console beside her seat and pressed the overhead call button with deliberate precision. A soft blue light illuminated above her head, accompanied by a gentle electronic chime that signaled passenger assistance was needed. The sound cut through the cabin's ambient noise like a dinner bell. Victoria, who was busy arranging crystal champagne flutes for the white passengers she deemed worthy of immediate attention, froze when she heard the call button. She slowly turned her head toward seat 2. Her eyes narrowing with absolute fury at what she perceived as Maya's audacious challenge to her authority. Taking a deep breath that seemed to inflate her with righteous indignation, Victoria handed the champagne bottle to Marcus with unnecessary force and stomped down the aisle toward Maya's seat. Her heels clicked against the industrial carpeting like gunshots, and her entire posture radiated barely contained rage. Without any preamble or polite inquiry, Victoria reached up and violently punched the call button to extinguish the blue light. The aggressive gesture was witnessed by every passenger in the forward cabin, and the hostility was unmistakable. "Ma'am," Victoria said, leaning down so her face was uncomfortably close to Maya's. "The boarding process is a highly regulated and extremely busy time for the flight crew. The call button is reserved for genuine emergencies only while we remain at the gate. Whatever you think you need can wait until we reach cruising altitude." "I have a medical requirement," Maya said calmly, picking up the amber prescription bottle and holding it where Victoria could see it clearly. "I need to take this medication before the cabin doors close for departure. I requested a glass of water from your colleague and you prevented him from providing basic service. I would like that water now, please." Victoria sighed dramatically, an exaggerated sound of pure exasperation that was designed to make Maya feel like an unreasonable burden on the entire flight crew. "As I explained to you, we are extremely busy preparing for departure," Victoria replied with icy condescension. "Furthermore, our bottled water allocation for pre-departure service has been depleted by our premium passengers. You will need to wait until we reach 10,000 feet and begin regular cabin service." Maya glanced past Victoria toward the preparation galley where she could clearly see 3 unopened glass bottles of Evian water sitting in plain sight on the service cart, less than 10 feet away from where they were having this conversation. "There are multiple bottles of water visible on your cart," Maya pointed out, her voice remaining impossibly steady and controlled. She wasn't raising her voice, wasn't creating a scene, but she was absolutely unyielding in her reasonable request for basic service. Victoria's face flushed an ugly mottled red that clashed with her platinum hair and perfect makeup. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone she had already decided was beneath her attention and unworthy of first-class treatment. "That water is specifically reserved for our meal service preparation," Victoria snapped, her voice growing shrill. "If you cannot follow the reasonable instructions of the flight crew, I will be forced to classify you as an unruly passenger and have you removed from this aircraft. Do you understand what that classification means?" The threat was clear, immediate, and completely disproportionate to Maya's calm request for a glass of water to take prescribed medication. Several passengers in nearby seats were now openly staring at the confrontation, their faces showing various degrees of shock, discomfort, and outrage at Victoria's unprofessional behavior. Roberto Kim lowered his Financial Times and spoke up loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear his frustration with the discriminatory service. "For God's sake, Victoria," he said, using her first name with deliberate familiarity. "Just give the woman a glass of water. This is ridiculous. I'll give up my meal service allocation if it's such a critical resource management issue." Victoria shot Roberto a tight, fake smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of diplomatic expression she reserved for passengers she couldn't afford to alienate completely. "I appreciate your patience," Mr. Kim, Victoria replied through gritted teeth. "I'm simply following established airline policies and federal regulations regarding pre-departure procedures." She turned back to Maya, her expression triumphant and coldly satisfied with her perceived victory in this power struggle. "Wait until we are airborne and regular service begins or deplane immediately," Victoria said with absolute finality. Those are your only options, and I strongly recommend you choose quickly before I involve airport security in this situation." With a sharp spin on her expensive heels, Victoria marched back toward the forward galley, leaving Maya sitting calmly in seat 2A with her untaken medication and a cabin full of witnesses to the most blatant discrimination any of them had ever observed on a commercial flight. Maya sat back in her leather seat, showing no external signs of the corporate fury building inside her analytical mind. She didn't deplane. She didn't shout. She didn't create the kind of scene that Victoria clearly expected and probably wanted as justification for having her removed from the aircraft. Instead, Maya unzipped her beaten-up Nike backpack and pulled out a sleek matte black laptop that looked distinctly out of place among her deliberately casual clothing. The computer was a custom-built machine worth more than most people's annual salary, and right in the center of the lid, usually concealed by a protective leather sleeve that Maya had deliberately left behind tonight, was a highly restricted holographic corporate asset tag. The sticker was issued exclusively to the top 5 executives of major corporations and contained embedded security features that marked it as property of Richardson Capital Holdings. As Captain James Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom announcing that the main cabin doors were about to close and final departure preparations were beginning, Maya opened her laptop and connected to the aircraft's internal ground communication network using executive credentials that she had configured during the acquisition process. She began typing an encrypted email to her chief legal officer, her executive assistant, and the newly appointed head of human resources for Apex Airways. The message was brief, professional, and devastating in its implications. She was documenting everything Victoria's discriminatory behavior, her refusal to provide basic service, her threats of passenger removal, and the complete failure of management oversight that had allowed such toxic culture to flourish unchecked. From the forward galley, Victoria was watching Maya with growing suspicion and irrational anger. She saw the expensive laptop. She observed the confident, professional way Maya was typing. And in Victoria's prejudiced, narrow mind, a new conspiracy theory began to form. She convinced herself that Maya was either recording the interaction to create a false discrimination lawsuit, attempting to hack into the aircraft's wireless network without paying for premium internet access, or possibly even engaging in some kind of corporate espionage. The fact that a black woman in casual clothing could be conducting legitimate business on expensive equipment challenged every assumption Victoria had built her worldview around. Rather than questioning her own biases, Victoria doubled down on her prejudice and decided that Maya represented a direct threat to her authority and the proper order of her cabin. "That's enough," Victoria muttered to Marcus, who was trying to complete the pre-departure service while avoiding the toxic atmosphere his supervisor had created. She grabbed a clipboard from the galley counter with shaking hands. "I'm not flying across the Atlantic Ocean with this attitude problem disrupting my cabin." Victoria began marching back down the narrow aisle toward seat 2. Her face flushed with unwarranted rage and her hands trembling with adrenaline. She was completely unaware that she was about to make the biggest and most career-ending mistake of her professional life. Every step she took was being captured by Isabella's phone camera, which was now live streaming to her Instagram followers who were watching the confrontation unfold in real time. The Boeing 777's auxiliary power unit provided a low vibrating soundtrack to the mounting tension in the first-class cabin. Other passengers had stopped their conversations, put down their phones, and were watching the approaching confrontation with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for impending traffic accidents. "Excuse me," Victoria snapped as she reached Maya's seat, making no attempt to lower her voice or maintain any pretense of professionalism. Every passenger in first class was now staring directly at the unfolding drama. "I need you to shut down that electronic device immediately. We are preparing for departure, and your unauthorized computer use violates multiple federal regulations and company policies." Maya did not stop typing. She didn't even look up from her screen where she was finishing her detailed documentation of the discriminatory treatment she had experienced. The main cabin door was still open, the safety briefing had not begun, and federal aviation regulations explicitly permitted personal electronic device usage during this phase of the departure process. "The cabin door remains open?" Victoria Maya replied with the same calm, measured tone she had maintained throughout the entire interaction. "FAA regulations permit the use of personal electronics until the door is sealed and the safety briefing commences. I am finishing an urgent business communication, and I will comply with all applicable regulations when they take effect." It was Maya's unshakable composure that broke something fundamental inside Victoria's mind. If Maya had yelled, if she had cowered, if she had shown any sign of intimidation or submission, Victoria would have felt satisfied with her display of authority. But this complete dismissal, this cold corporate confidence radiating from a woman Victoria had decided didn't belong in first class, short-circuited every mechanism Victoria used to maintain her sense of superiority and control. "I am giving you a direct lawful crew member instruction," Victoria said, her voice rising to near shouting level. "You are violating company policy and federal regulations. Close that computer immediately, or I will confiscate it as a security threat." For the first time since the interaction began, Maya stopped typing. She slowly turned her head away from the laptop screen, her dark eyes locking onto Victoria's flushed, angry face. There was no rage in Maya's expression, no emotional reaction whatsoever. Instead, there was something far more terrifying, a chilling clinical assessment of exactly what kind of person she was dealing with and what needed to be done about it. "You will not touch my property," Maya said quietly. The words were softly spoken, but they carried the weight and authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You will step back from my seat. You will allow me to finish this communication. And you will seriously reconsider your approach to customer service before I make a final decision regarding your continued employment with this company." It was a warning. A very clear, very literal warning delivered with the kind of measured precision that should have immediately signaled to Victoria that she was dealing with someone far above her pay grade and authority level. But Victoria, blinded by years of unchecked prejudice and desperate to maintain control over what she perceived as an unacceptable challenge to her cabin authority, completely missed the implication. She heard only defiance. She saw only insolence. And in her mind, this black woman in discount clothing was openly challenging her power in front of premium passengers who expected Victoria to maintain order and proper standards. "Who do you think you are?" Victoria hissed, leaning closer to Maya's seat. Before Maya could answer, before anyone could intervene, Victoria made the decision that would destroy her career and transform her into a symbol of workplace discrimination that would be studied in corporate training programs for decades. She lunged forward, reaching across the wide first-class console toward Maya's laptop with the clear intention of slamming it shut and asserting her authority through physical force. Her manicured fingers were aimed directly at the keyboard, ready to violate Maya's personal property and professional privacy in the most aggressive way possible. But Maya's reflexes were faster and sharper than Victoria anticipated. 2 decades of navigating the cutthroat world of private equity had given Maya a zero-tolerance policy for physical boundary violations and aggressive intimidation tactics. She had learned to defend herself in boardrooms filled with hostile executives who tried to use physical presence and aggressive behavior to undermine her authority. Maya brought her left arm up smoothly and efficiently, catching Victoria's wrist in midair and stopping the flight attendant's hand several inches away from the laptop keyboard. She didn't twist Victoria's arm, didn't apply painful pressure, didn't use excessive force. She simply blocked the aggressive movement with firm, controlled defense. "I told you," Maya repeated, her voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous register. "Do not touch my property. Victoria gasped dramatically, yanking her arm back as if Maya's touch had burned her skin. In that moment, panic and rage created a toxic combination that flooded Victoria's nervous process with adrenaline and completely destroyed whatever remained of her professional judgment. She looked around the cabin, seeing the shocked faces of passengers who were clearly on Maya's side, witnessing her own aggressive behavior, recording her unprofessional conduct with their phones. She realized that the situation was spiraling completely out of her control, that she was being exposed as the aggressor, that her authority was crumbling in front of everyone she was supposed to impress. In a split second of pure, unadulterated madness, driven by prejudice, entitlement, and desperation to reassert dominance, Victoria's right hand flew through the air with all the force she could generate. Crack! The sound of Victoria's open palm striking Maya's face was deafening. It echoed off the curved overhead compartments like a gunshot, cutting through every conversation and background noise in the cabin with shocking violence. The slap was delivered with full force, driven by years of suppressed racism and the kind of rage that comes from having your assumed superiority challenged by someone you consider fundamentally inferior. A collective gasp sucked all the air out of the first-class cabin, as if the aircraft had suddenly depressurized. The sound was followed by absolute horrifying silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Across the aisle, Isabella's phone captured every second of the assault in high-definition video. Her jaw dropped and she nearly fumbled her device, but her journalistic instincts kept her filming even as she whispered, "Oh my God," into the camera. She got it all. She got everything. In seat 3B, Roberto Kim half stood from his seat, his newspaper crumpling in his fists as he stared in disbelief at what he had just witnessed. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted toward Victoria, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Behind the galley curtain, Marcus Torres went completely pale, his hands flying to cover his mouth in shock and horror. He had never seen anything like this in his 8 months with the airline. He had never imagined that a flight attendant could physically assault a passenger and still be standing in the cabin as if nothing had happened. Maya's head had snapped to the right from the force of the blow. The cabin descended into the kind of silence that follows a catastrophic accident where everyone knows something terrible has happened, but no one can quite process the reality of what they've witnessed. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Maya turned her head back to face Victoria. Her left cheek was already blooming with angry red inflammation. A small cut on the inside of her lip where it had been driven against her teeth by the force of the slap produced a bright red drop of blood that gathered at the corner of her mouth like evidence of a war crime. Maya raised her right hand calmly and used the pad of her thumb to wipe away the drop of blood. She looked at the red smear on her skin for a long moment, then raised her eyes to meet Victoria's gaze directly. Her expression was terrifyingly calm, completely controlled, and absolutely lethal in its implications. Victoria stood frozen beside the seat, her chest heaving, her hand still tingling from the impact, her eyes wide with the sudden horrible realization of what she had just done. But pride and prejudice are poisonous things, and instead of immediately apologizing, instead of recognizing the magnitude of her mistake, Victoria doubled down on her aggression with the desperation of someone who knows they've crossed a line they can never uncross. "You grabbed me!" Victoria shouted, backing away from Maya's seat and pointing a trembling finger at her like an accusation. "You physically assaulted a crew member. I was defending myself against an aggressive passenger who refused to follow crew instructions." The lie was so blatant, so obviously false in the face of what everyone had witnessed, that several passengers immediately began protesting. "That's completely untrue," Roberto called out, pulling out his own phone to start recording. "She never touched you except to block your attempt to grab her computer. You attacked her without any provocation whatsoever." Isabella was already uploading the video to her social media accounts, her fingers flying across her phone screen. "I got the whole thing on video," she announced to the cabin. This is going straight to Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. People need to see exactly what happened here. Maya slowly closed her laptop with a soft click that sounded like a judge's gavel falling. She placed the computer carefully back into her backpack, zipped it shut, and looked directly at Victoria with the kind of cold analytical stare that had intimidated Fortune 500 CEOs and dismantled hostile corporate boards. Victoria Hartwell. Maya said, her voice terrifyingly steady and devoid of any emotion except icy determination. Employee IE D7749. Senior flight attendant. 14 years of service with this company. You have just committed aggravated assault against a passenger, demonstrated clear racial discrimination, and violated every professional standard that governs commercial aviation. Victoria's face went from flushed red to pale white in a matter of seconds. Something in Maya's tone, something in the precise way she recited Victoria's employment details, something in the absolute confidence with which she spoke, triggered a warning bell deep in Victoria's subconscious. But her conscious mind was still too flooded with adrenaline and defensive anger to process the implications. "I don't know who you think you are," Victoria stammered, "but you can't threaten me. I'm calling the captain immediately. You're being removed from this aircraft for assault on a crew member and disruptive behavior." Maya reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her phone. She tapped a single contact from her favorites list and put the call on speakerphone, holding the device up so everyone in the nearby seats could hear both sides of the conversation clearly. The call connected immediately, answered on the first ring by a sharp, professional voice that carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to handling corporate crises. "Richardson Capital Holdings Chief Legal Office. This is Jonathan Hayes." "Jonathan?" Maya said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin's tense silence. "I'm calling from Apex Airways Flight 847 at Chicago O'Hare. I need you to contact Captain Morrison immediately and inform him that I've been physically assaulted by a member of his cabin crew. I also need you to initiate Protocol 7 for hostile workplace documentation." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of rapid typing and what sounded like multiple phone lines being activated simultaneously. "Understood completely." "Ms. Richardson." Jonathan's voice came through the speaker with laser-focused intensity. "Protocol 7 is now active. All documentation processes are initiated. Captain Morrison will be contacted within 60 seconds. Do you require immediate medical attention or law enforcement response?" "Medical attention is not necessary at this time," Maya replied, touching her swollen cheek gently. "However, I will be pressing full criminal charges for assault and battery. Please contact Chicago Police and have them respond to Gate 17A immediately." "Consider it done," Jonathan confirmed. "Recording all details now. Incident logged at 7:47 p.m. Central Standard Time." Maya ended the call and looked back at Victoria, whose face had gone completely ashen as the implications of what she had just heard began to penetrate her shocked consciousness. The confidence was draining out of Victoria like air from a punctured balloon, replaced by a growing sense of dread that she couldn't yet fully understand. "You just called your lawyer," Victoria said weakly, as if she was trying to convince herself that what she had witnessed couldn't possibly be real. "Passengers don't have corporate attorneys on speed dial. This has to be some kind of scam or performance." But even as Victoria spoke the words, she could see the doubt in her own voice, reflected in the faces of every passenger around her. Roberto was shaking his head in disbelief at her continued denial. Isabella was live-streaming the entire conversation to thousands of viewers. Marcus was standing behind the galley curtain looking like he wanted to disappear entirely. Maya stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. At her full height, she commanded the attention of everyone in the cabin, not through aggression or volume, but through an unmistakable presence that radiated authority and power. "Victoria," Maya said quietly, You have approximately 3 minutes before Captain Morrison comes out of that cockpit. You have perhaps 5 minutes before Chicago police board this aircraft. And you have exactly 30 seconds to decide whether you want to compound your assault charge with additional charges of filing a false police report. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. And for the first time since the interaction began, Victoria Hartwell began to understand that she had made a mistake that would change her life forever. Heavy footsteps echoed down the jet bridge as Chicago police officers arrived at Gate 17A. Detective Sarah O'Connor and Officer Miguel Rodriguez had responded to the call about an assault on a commercial aircraft, expecting to find the typical scenario: an intoxicated or mentally unstable passenger who had become violent toward crew members and needed to be removed for everyone's safety. What they found instead was a cabin full of passengers united in outrage against a flight attendant who had clearly crossed every professional and legal boundary that governed commercial aviation. Detective O'Connor was a 15-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department who had seen every possible variation of air rage passenger disputes and crew conflicts that could occur in the confined space of an aircraft. She was a sharp, no-nonsense investigator who could read a situation in seconds and separate truth from fiction with surgical precision. Officer Rodriguez was newer to the aviation beat but had extensive experience with assault cases. He understood the legal requirements for witness statements, evidence collection, and the particular challenges of prosecuting crimes that occurred on aircraft under federal jurisdiction. The officers boarded the plane expecting to arrest a disruptive passenger. Instead, they walked into a situation that would redefine their understanding of corporate power and workplace discrimination. Behind the police officers came Richard Blackstone, the Vice President of Ground Operations for Apex Airways at Chicago O'Hare. Richard was 47 years old, 23 years with the company, and responsible for managing every aspect of flight operations, passenger services, and crew coordination at one of the airline's busiest hubs. Richard had been called away from dinner with his family to handle what dispatch had described as a Code 7 situation: passenger assault on crew member, possible federal charges, immediate supervisor response required. Any incident that could delay or cancel a transatlantic flight represented thousands of dollars in lost revenue, crew overtime costs, passenger compensation, and potential legal liability. He carried his corporate tablet loaded with passenger manifests, crew records, and incident report forms, ready to process whatever paperwork was necessary to resolve the situation quickly and minimize damage to the airline's already fragile reputation. Richard had dealt with hundreds of passenger incidents over his career, from medical emergencies to security threats to garden-variety air rage cases that required police intervention. He had developed an efficient protocol for these situations: identify the disruptive individual, gather basic information, coordinate with law enforcement for removal, and process the incident documentation to protect the company from legal liability. As Richard approached the aircraft door, he could see Victoria Hartwell standing near the forward galley, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and speaking in hushed, urgent tones to Captain Morrison. Victoria had clearly been crying, her makeup was smeared, and she was displaying all the physical signs of someone who had been traumatized by a violent encounter. This appeared to be a straightforward case. Aggressive passenger had attacked a crew member. Police were removing the individual, and Richard needed to complete the paperwork to ban the person from future travel and potentially pursue federal charges for interfering with a flight crew. "Officers," Richard called out as he stepped onto the aircraft, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. "I'm Richard Blackstone, 5th P of Ground Operations. I understand we have an unruly passenger who assaulted one of our flight attendants. I need to get identification information so we can process an immediate travel ban and coordinate with federal authorities." Detective O'Connor looked around the cabin, noting immediately that the passengers seemed far more agitated with the flight attendant than with any passenger who might have been violent. Isabella was still live streaming on her phone, providing real-time commentary to her growing audience about the discrimination and assault they had just witnessed. Roberto Kim was standing in the aisle, clearly frustrated and eager to provide a witness statement that would contradict whatever story the flight attendant had told. Marcus Torres looked pale and shaken, standing behind the galley curtain like he was afraid to be associated with whatever Victoria had done. "Mr. Blackstone," Detective O'Connor said, approaching the VP with professional courtesy, but obvious skepticism about the situation. "We're going to need to interview all witnesses before we determine who, if anyone, gets arrested here. From what we're hearing from passengers, the story might be different from what your crew member reported." "Different," Victoria interjected, stepping forward with renewed confidence now that her supervisor had arrived. "Officers, that passenger in seat 2A physically grabbed my arm when I tried to enforce federal aviation regulations. When I defended myself, she became aggressive and threatening. She needs to be removed immediately before she endangers other passengers." Richard looked down the aisle toward seat 2A, expecting to see an obviously disturbed individual who fit the typical profile of an air rage case. Instead, he saw a black woman in casual clothing sitting calmly in her seat, showing no signs of intoxication, mental instability, or aggressive behavior. She appeared to be waiting patiently for the investigation to proceed, completely unbothered by the presence of police officers. Something about the scene didn't match Victoria's description of events. Richard had seen genuinely dangerous passengers before, and they didn't typically sit quietly in their assigned seats while police boarded the aircraft. They were usually restrained, shouting, or displaying obvious signs of the mental or emotional instability that had led to their violent behavior. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez called out, approaching Maya's seat with professional caution. "We're going to need you to gather your belongings and come with us so we can sort out what happened here. We need to conduct interviews away from the aircraft." "I'm perfectly willing to cooperate with your investigation," Maya replied calmly, standing up and shouldering her backpack. "I agree that this conversation should continue in a more appropriate venue than the passenger cabin." She stepped into the aisle, flanked by the two officers, and began walking toward the front of the aircraft. As she passed Victoria, the flight attendant shot her a look of smug, vindictive satisfaction. In Victoria's mind, the process was working exactly as it should. The disruptive passenger was being removed, order was being restored, and her authority was being validated by law enforcement. Victoria had no idea that she was about to witness the complete destruction of her career and reputation in front of everyone she had been trying to impress. The group moved off the aircraft and onto the enclosed jet bridge, where Richard had set up a temporary workspace with his tablet and incident report forms. The jet bridge provided a private space for sensitive conversations while keeping the investigation close to the aircraft for easy access to additional witnesses if needed. "All right," Richard said, activating his tablet and pulling up the incident report template. "Officers, I need the passenger's identification so we can flag her profile in our reservation process and initiate a permanent travel ban. Ma'am, you're being removed from Apex Airways property for assaulting a crew member, and you will not be permitted to fly with our airline again." Richard's tone was efficient, professional, and completely confident. He had processed dozens of similar cases, and the procedure was routine: collect identification document, the incident coordinate with law enforcement, and move on to damage control with other passengers. "I would be happy to provide identification." "Mr. Blackstone." Maya said, her voice echoing slightly in the metal tunnel of the jet bridge. "However, I believe you may want to review the situation more carefully before you proceed with a travel ban." Richard paused, his typing something in Maya's tone, triggering a vague sense of unease that he couldn't quite identify. Ma'am, we have a clear statement from our senior flight attendant regarding your aggressive behavior," Richard replied, his confidence wavering slightly. "Company policy requires immediate action when passengers assault crew members. I need your identification now so we can complete the incident documentation." Maya reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. Instead of extracting a driver's license or passport, she removed a heavy, black titanium card that immediately caught the overhead lights of the jet bridge. The card was clearly not a standard form of identification, and it carried an unmistakable aura of corporate authority and executive privilege. "Mr. Blackstone," Maya said, extending the card toward him with deliberate precision. "I believe this will clarify the situation considerably." Richard took the card with 2 fingers, expecting to see a corporate credit card or perhaps a frequent flyer membership that might warrant special handling. Instead, he found himself staring at an executive identification badge that made his blood run cold and his hands start trembling uncontrollably. The card was embossed with the Apex Airways corporate logo, but unlike the standard employee badges that featured blue plastic and basic identification information, this was clearly something far more significant. The titanium surface carried embedded security features and holographic elements that marked it as genuine corporate executive identification. Most importantly, the card displayed Maya's name and title in raised lettering that left no room for misinterpretation. Dr. Maya Richardson, Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board, Richardson Capital Holdings. Below that, in smaller text that made Richard's vision blur with panic, majority shareholder and acting CEO Apex Airways. The heavy metal card slipped from Richard's fingers, clattering loudly onto the jet bridge floor with a sound like a death knell. His corporate tablet followed immediately afterward, the impact spiderwebbing the screen into 1,000 jagged pieces that reflected the overhead lighting like broken glass. "Oh, dear God." Richard whispered the words escaping his lungs in a ragged gasp that seemed to echo down the length of the jet bridge. "Ms. Richardson." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Detective O'Connor and Officer Rodriguez exchanged confused glances, clearly sensing that a massive shift in the dynamic had just occurred, but not yet understanding the implications. Richard looked like a man who had just opened what he thought was a routine email, only to discover that his entire division was being eliminated and his career was over. His face had gone completely pale and sweat was beginning to break out across his forehead, despite the December cold that was seeping through the jet bridge walls. Yesterday morning, Richard had sat through a mandatory corporate briefing where the new ownership structure had been outlined in detail. He had seen the portfolio analysis, read the ruthless efficiency reports in the Wall Street Journal, and listened to the terrifyingly calm voice of Richardson Capital Holdings founder describing her zero-tolerance policy for operational failures and cultural toxicity. The briefing had included detailed financial projections, efficiency targets, and personnel restructuring plans that would affect thousands of employees across the company. Richard had taken careful notes, knowing that his performance would be under intense scrutiny as the new management team evaluated every aspect of the airline's operations. And now, the billionaire who controlled the fate of every Apex Airways employee, the woman whose acquisition of the airline represented his job security and his family's financial future, was standing in front of him with a swollen red handprint across her left cheek, inflicted by a member of his staff. "Mr. Blackstone," Maya said, her voice not raising in volume but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to having her words treated as corporate law. "It appears your ground operations staff is as poorly managed as your in-flight service teams. I would suggest you retrieve your tablet and prepare to document this incident with considerably more care than you were planning 60 seconds ago." Richard scrambled to his knees on the cold metal floor of the jet bridge, his expensive suit collecting dust and grime as he frantically gathered the broken pieces of his corporate tablet. He stood up, clutching the damaged device against his chest, his hands shaking so violently that the broken screen rattled like loose change. "Ms. Richardson, I had absolutely no idea you were traveling with us this evening," Richard stammered, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "You weren't listed on our VIP manifest. The reservation process didn't flag your name in our executive recognition protocol. If I had known if anyone had realized who you were, this never would have happened." "I am fully aware of that," Richard Maya replied smoothly, her tone carrying the kind of measured precision she used when dismantling underperforming corporate boards. That was entirely intentional. I wanted an authentic assessment of the Apex Airways customer experience, and I must say that the transparency has been absolutely illuminating. Detective O'Connor stepped forward, her investigative instincts finally piecing together the corporate dynamics that were playing out in front of her. "Excuse me, but I need clarification about what's happening here. Are you telling me that the assault victim owns the airline? Dr. Richardson holds an 89% controlling stake in Apex Airways." Richard confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "She is the CEO of Richardson Capital Holdings and our new chairman of the board. The acquisition was finalized 72 hours ago." Officer Rodriguez stared at Maya, then at Richard, then at the broken tablet, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. So the passenger who was allegedly disruptive actually owns the company that employed the flight attendant who hit her. "That is correct," Maya said calmly. "And I can assure you, officers, that I was not disruptive in any way. I simply requested a glass of water to take prescribed medication, and I was subjected to discriminatory treatment that escalated to physical assault when I declined to submit to Miss Hartwell's prejudiced assumptions about my right to occupy the seat I had purchased." Richard closed his eyes, finally understanding the full magnitude of the catastrophe that had just occurred under his supervision. Not only had a member of his cabin crew physically assaulted a passenger, but that passenger was the single most powerful person in the entire aviation industry, someone whose decisions could affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in revenue. "Ms. Richardson," Richard said, his voice taking on the desperate tone of someone pleading for professional survival. "I need to go back onto that aircraft immediately. I need to bring Captain Morrison and Ms. Hartwell out here so we can resolve this situation before it escalates any further." "That would be advisable." Richard. Maya agreed, her expression showing no mercy or sympathy for his obvious distress. "However, I want you to be very clear about something before you speak to Ms. Hartwell. You will not tell her who I am. You will inform her that the police officers need her statement to finalize my arrest and removal from the airline. Let her complete her version of events before she learns the truth." "Yes, ma'am," Richard replied immediately, understanding that he was being given an opportunity to document Victoria's lies and discriminatory behavior before she had a chance to modify her story out of self-preservation. Richard practically sprinted back toward the aircraft door, his broken tablet clutched against his chest, and his mind racing with damage control scenarios and crisis management protocols. He knew that the next few minutes would determine not only Victoria's career fate, but quite possibly his own position with the company and the future of Apex Airways as a viable business entity. Behind him, Maya stood calmly in the jet bridge, flanked by the two police officers who were beginning to understand that they had walked into a situation far more complex and significant than a typical passenger disturbance case. Detective O'Connor looked at Maya with newfound respect and professional curiosity. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I've been investigating assault cases for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Are you planning to press full criminal charges against the flight attendant?" Maya touched her swollen cheek gently, feeling the tender skin where Victoria's hand had made contact with enough force to leave a mark that would be visible for days. "Detective O'Connor." Maya replied, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded immediate attention. "I am absolutely pressing full criminal and civil charges. Ms. Hartwell didn't just assault me personally. She assaulted every passenger who has ever been discriminated against because of their race, their clothing, or their failure to meet arbitrary standards of acceptability. This case will set a precedent that will be remembered throughout the aviation industry." She paused, looking back toward the aircraft door where Richard was presumably delivering her instructions to Victoria and Captain Morrison. More importantly, Maya continued, "This incident will be documented, analyzed, and used to completely restructure the culture of this airline. Ms. Hartwell's behavior represents a cancer that has been allowed to metastasize throughout this organization, and surgical removal is the only appropriate treatment. Officer Rodriguez was taking detailed notes, understanding that this case would likely receive significant media attention and legal scrutiny. "Ma'am, do you have any concerns about your safety if we allow Miss Hartwell to provide her statement before she knows who you are?" "None whatsoever," Maya replied with absolute confidence. "Ms. Hartwell's lies and discriminatory attitudes are her weakness, not mine. I want them documented completely before she has any opportunity to claim that her behavior was influenced by knowledge of my position or authority." The three of them stood in the enclosed jet bridge waiting for Richard to return with Victoria and the captain, while Maya mentally prepared for the moment when Victoria Hartwell would finally understand the true magnitude of the mistake she had made. The reckoning was about to begin, and it would be absolute and irreversible. Inside the aircraft cabin, Richard Blackstone moved with the urgent desperation of a man whose career was hanging by a thread. He found Victoria Hartwell in the forward galley, still dabbing at her eyes with tissues and accepting sympathy from passengers who had only heard her version of events. She was holding court like a victim of unprovoked violence, describing her trauma to anyone who would listen. Captain Morrison stood nearby, reviewing the incident report that Victoria had hastily prepared. The captain was a veteran aviator with 28 years of experience, and he understood that any physical altercation involving crew members could result in flight delays, federal investigations, and significant legal liability for the airline. Victoria Richard called out, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Captain Morrison, I need both of you to come to the jet bridge immediately. The police officers require your statements to finalize the passenger's arrest and removal from airline property." Victoria's face brightened with vindictive satisfaction. She had convinced herself that justice was being served, that the disruptive passenger was finally facing consequences for her aggressive behavior, and that Victoria's authority was being validated by law enforcement intervention. "Of course, Mr. Blackstone," Victoria replied, straightening her uniform and smoothing her hair. "I'm ready to provide a complete statement about the passenger's assault and threatening behavior. The officers need to understand how dangerous she became when I tried to enforce federal regulations." Captain Morrison followed them off the aircraft, carrying his copy of the incident report and preparing to corroborate Victoria's account of events based on the information she had provided to him. He had not witnessed the actual confrontation, but he trusted his senior flight attendant's professional judgment and had no reason to doubt her description of passenger misconduct. As the three airline employees walked onto the jet bridge, Victoria was mentally rehearsing her statement, confident that she would be praised for her professional handling of a difficult situation and her courage in defending herself against an aggressive individual. She expected to see Maya Richardson in handcuffs, crying, pleading for a second chance, and facing the humiliating reality of being banned from commercial aviation. Instead, she saw Maya standing calmly between the two police officers, looking entirely composed and unfazed by the presence of law enforcement. The sight confused Victoria but didn't alarm her. She assumed that the formal arrest process was still pending, that the officers were simply gathering preliminary information before applying restraints and removing the disruptive passenger from airline property. "Officers," Victoria said, approaching Detective O'Connor with professional confidence. "I'm Victoria Hartwell, the senior flight attendant who was assaulted by the passenger in seat 2A. I'm ready to provide my complete statement about her aggressive and threatening behavior." Detective O'Connor looked at Victoria carefully, noting her composed demeanor and obvious expectation that Maya would be arrested based on her testimony. The detective had interviewed hundreds of assault victims over her career, and Victoria's behavior struck her as unusual for someone who had genuinely been attacked. "Ms. Hartwell," Detective O'Connor said, pulling out her notepad, "I need you to describe exactly what happened during your interaction with the passenger, starting from the beginning of the incident." Victoria took a deep breath, organizing her fabricated narrative in her mind. She had convinced herself that her version of events was truthful, that Maya's calm resistance to discriminatory treatment constituted aggression, and that her own physical assault was justified self-defense. The passenger in seat 2. A boarded the aircraft, displaying suspicious behavior from the moment she entered the cabin. Victoria began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. She was inappropriately dressed for first-class service, carrying questionable identification, and became immediately hostile when I attempted to verify her ticket authenticity according to standard security protocols. Maya listened to the lies with the same clinical detachment she had used when analyzing hostile corporate takeovers. Every false statement Victoria made was being recorded by Officer Rodriguez, creating legal evidence that would be used in criminal prosecution and civil litigation. When I attempted to enforce federal aviation regulations regarding electronic device usage during critical phases of flight operations, Victoria continued. The passenger became verbally abusive and physically aggressive. She grabbed my arm when I tried to secure her unauthorized recording equipment, and I was forced to defend myself against her assault. The fabrication was so complete, so thoroughly constructed that Victoria had apparently convinced herself it was true. She delivered the false statement with genuine emotion, her voice cracking slightly as she described her fictional trauma and heroic resistance to Maya's imaginary aggression. Captain Morrison nodded supportively, having accepted Victoria's account as factual when she first reported the incident to him in the cabin. Mr. Blackstone stood slightly behind the group, his face pale and his hands still trembling as he watched Victoria dig herself deeper into a legal hole that would destroy her career and expose her to criminal prosecution. Ms. Hartwell Detective O'Connor said when Victoria finished her statement. "Are you certain that your description of events is accurate and complete?" "Absolutely," Victoria replied without hesitation. "I have been a professional flight attendant for 14 years, and I take my responsibilities for passenger safety and federal regulation compliance extremely seriously. That woman was a clear threat to flight safety, and I responded appropriately to protect other passengers and crew members." Maya stepped forward, her movement drawing everyone's attention with quiet authority that seemed to change the atmospheric pressure in the enclosed jet bridge. Ms. Hartwell Maya said, her voice carrying across the metal space with perfect clarity. "Do you understand what perjury means?" Victoria blinked in confusion, taken aback by the question and irritated by Maya's continued refusal to show appropriate deference to the authority figures who were handling her case. "What are you talking about?" Victoria snapped, her confidence wavering slightly. "Officers, why is she being allowed to speak? Shouldn't she be restrained and removed from airline property?" Detective O'Connor looked at Maya, then back at Victoria, her experienced investigative instincts telling her that the power dynamic in the situation was not what it appeared to be on the surface. "Ms. Hartwell," the detective said carefully, "before we proceed with any arrests, I need to inform you that we have multiple passenger witnesses who are prepared to testify that your description of events is completely false." "That's impossible," Victoria protested, but something in the detective's tone made her voice sound less certain than it had moments before. "The passengers saw her assault me. They know I was defending myself against an aggressive individual who refused to follow crew instructions. Actually, Officer Rodriguez interjected, consulting his notes. We have video evidence from multiple sources showing that you struck the passenger without any physical provocation. We also have witness statements indicating that you engaged in discriminatory behavior based on the passenger's race and appearance." Victoria's face began to flush red again, but this time with growing panic rather than righteous anger. The confidence was draining out of her expression like water from a broken container. "That's not possible," Victoria stammered. "There must be some mistake. The passengers don't understand what they saw. They don't know the regulations and security protocols that I'm required to enforce." Maya reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her phone. She selected a contact from her favorites list and activated the speaker function holding the device so everyone in the jet bridge could hear both sides of the conversation clearly. "Richardson Capital Holdings Legal Department. This is Jonathan Hayes, Chief Legal Officer," Jonathan, Maya said calmly. "I need you to provide identity verification for the Apex Airways personnel who were present with Chicago police regarding my assault case." "Absolutely." Ms. Richardson. Jonathan's voice came through the speaker with immediate professional response. Please identify the individuals requiring verification. Maya looked directly at Richard Blackstone, who had gone completely pale and was staring at her with the expression of someone watching their career evaporate in real time. Mr. Richard Blackstone, Vice President of Ground Operations, and Miss Victoria Hartwell. Senior Flight Attendant, Employee Identification Number 7749. There was a brief pause while Jonathan accessed the corporate personnel database that had been transferred to Richardson Capital Holdings as part of the acquisition. Mr. Blackstone Jonathan's voice continued, Please be advised that you are speaking with Dr. Maya Richardson, Chief Executive Officer and controlling shareholder of your employing company. Ms. Richardson has full authority over all personnel decisions, operational policies, and corporate governance matters affecting Apex Airways. The silence that followed was deafening. Captain Morrison's incident report slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the jet bridge floor like a dead leaf. Richard's broken tablet, which he had been clutching against his chest, fell again with a crash that echoed off the metal walls. Victoria stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound, her brain struggling to process information that contradicted everything she had believed about the situation for the past hour. Furthermore, Jonathan continued, Ms. Hartwell should be advised that providing false statements to law enforcement regarding her assault of the company's chief executive officer constitutes grounds for immediate termination, criminal prosecution, and civil liability that could result in significant financial damages. Maya ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. She looked at Victoria with the same cold, analytical expression she had used when dissolving underperforming corporate boards and restructuring failing companies. Victoria Maya said quietly, the word carrying more weight than any shouting could have achieved, Do you understand who you just hit? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she had to grab the handrail of the jet bridge to keep from collapsing entirely. The color had drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost of the confident, prejudiced woman who had dominated the aircraft cabin just minutes before. Victoria whispered the words barely escaping her throat. You're the CEO. I am. Maya confirmed, stepping closer until she was directly in front of the woman who had assaulted her. And you, Victoria, are unemployed. Detective O'Connor stepped forward, her handcuffs already in her hand. Ms. Hartwell, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing around Victoria's wrists was the loudest sound any of them had ever heard. It echoed down the jet bridge like the final note of a funeral dirge marking the end of Victoria's career, her reputation, and her freedom. No, please, Victoria sobbed as the cold steel tightened around her wrists. Ms. Richardson, I made a mistake. I was stressed. I've been with this airline for 14 years. You can't let them arrest me. I have a mortgage. I have responsibilities. Maya's expression didn't change. Her voice remained calm, professional, and absolutely merciless. I am not having you arrested, Victoria. You are being arrested because you committed a felony assault against a passenger while performing your duties as a flight attendant. The fact that I happen to own this airline is simply your extraordinarily bad luck. She paused, watching as Officer Rodriguez began the process of escorting Victoria toward the terminal in handcuffs. Had you assaulted any other passenger the way you assaulted me? Maya continued. You might have faced only termination and a civil lawsuit, but because your victim was me, your case will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law, and it will be used to set legal precedents that will transform how airlines handle workplace discrimination and passenger rights. Victoria's sobs echoed down the jet bridge as the officers began walking her toward the terminal, past the passengers who were waiting for their delayed flight, past the airport workers who stopped to stare at the unusual sight of a flight attendant in handcuffs, past the security cameras that would capture her humiliation for the incident reports that would be studied in aviation management courses for decades. Maya turned to Richard Blackstone, who was standing motionless, still clutching his broken tablet and looking like a man who had just witnessed his own execution. Richard, Maya said, her voice taking on the tone she used when conducting corporate restructuring meetings. Effective immediately, Ms. Hartwell's employment with Apex Airways is terminated for cause. Specifically, she is being terminated for assault of a passenger discrimination based on race and appearance, providing false statements to law enforcement, and gross violation of professional conduct standards. Cancel her flight benefits, revoke her security clearance, freeze her pension, pending legal review, and flag her personnel file for permanent employment ban across all Richardson Capital Holdings subsidiaries. "It's already being processed, ma'am," Richard replied, his voice barely audible. "Corporate Human Resources received the termination order 3 minutes ago." Maya then looked at Captain Morrison, who had been standing in stunned silence throughout the entire revelation. "Captain, Maya said your flight has been delayed long enough. I suggest you return to the aircraft, complete your pre-flight procedures, and prepare for departure to London. Your passengers deserve the professional service they paid for." "Yes, Ms. Richardson," Captain Morrison replied, snapping to attention like a military officer receiving orders from a commanding general. "We'll be ready for departure within 20 minutes. As the captain hurried back toward the aircraft, Maya turned her attention to the larger implications of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about punishing one discriminatory employee. This was about transforming an entire corporate culture and establishing new standards for the aviation industry. She pulled out her phone again and made another call, this time to her executive assistant. "Nia, it's Maya. I need you to initiate a comprehensive audit of all Apex Airways personnel files. Flag every employee with discrimination complaints, every supervisor who dismissed those complaints, and every manager who failed to address cultural problems. We're not just changing policies, we're changing people." The transformation of Apex Airways had begun, and it would be absolute, comprehensive, and irreversible. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the Chicago Marriott Magnificent Mile was filled with 800 airline executives, employees, and industry leaders who had gathered for the most significant corporate transformation announcement in aviation history. The massive space buzzed with anticipation as attendees from across the global airline industry waited to hear how Apex Airways had achieved the most dramatic turnaround in commercial aviation. Dr. Maya Richardson stood at the gleaming podium, no longer wearing the faded hoodie and joggers that had concealed her identity on that December evening. She was dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit that radiated executive authority and commanded immediate respect from every person in the ballroom. Her presence filled the enormous space with the kind of quiet power that transformed audiences into captive witnesses to corporate history. When I acquired this airline 6 months ago, Maya's voice rang out clearly, cutting through the murmur of conversation and focusing every eye in the room on her words. "The financial analysts told me it was a hopeless investment. They said the culture was too toxic, too deeply embedded to save. They predicted that any attempt at meaningful change would be met with resistance lawsuits and ultimate failure." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd of executives, union representatives, and industry journalists who had come to document what many were calling the most successful corporate restructuring in modern aviation. But culture, ladies and gentlemen, is not an invisible force that we simply absorb through the air we breathe. Culture is the direct sum total of our individual actions, our daily choices, and our response to moments when we must decide between convenience and character. Maya gestured toward the front row where Marcus Torres sat, wearing a perfectly fitted manager's uniform, beaming with pride, and representing the kind of transformation that had become the hallmark of the new Apex Airways. Marcus had been promoted 3 times in 6 months, moving from junior flight attendant to senior flight attendant to cabin crew supervisor to his current position as regional director of in-flight experience. His promotion wasn't based on seniority or political connections. It was based on his demonstrated commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. His courage in standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, and his natural leadership ability that had emerged once he was given the opportunity to flourish in a supportive environment. We removed the cancer that had infected this organization. Maya continued her tone, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. We terminated executives who looked the other way when discrimination occurred. We fired supervisors who enabled toxic behavior through willful ignorance. And we promoted individuals who demonstrated that exceptional service and basic human decency are not mutually exclusive concepts. The audience responded with sustained applause, but Maya wasn't finished delivering the message that would reshape how the entire industry thought about corporate responsibility and cultural change. Today I am proud to announce that Apex Airways is not just profitable for the first time in 7 years. We have achieved something more significant than financial success. We have become the highest-rated airline for customer satisfaction in North America, and we achieved this transformation not by cutting costs or reducing service, but by elevating our humanity and holding ourselves accountable for our actions. The standing ovation that erupted from the ballroom was deafening, lasting for nearly 3 minutes, as executives, employees, and industry representatives recognized that they were witnessing a fundamental shift in how airlines could operate when they prioritized people over profit margins and character over convenience. Maya smiled a genuine expression of satisfaction that came from seeing abstract corporate values transformed into concrete results that improved thousands of lives. She had taken a broken, diseased organization and rebuilt it from the foundation up, creating something stronger and more sustainable than what had existed before. But the transformation of Apex Airways was only part of the story that had emerged from that December evening in Chicago. The case of Victoria Hartwell had become a landmark precedent in federal employment law and aviation regulation. The criminal charges had resulted in a guilty plea to assault and battery, with Victoria receiving 6 months of community service, 2 years of probation, and a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. The civil litigation had been even more devastating. Maya's legal team had pursued not just compensatory damages for the assault, but punitive damages designed to send a message throughout the aviation industry that discrimination and violence against passengers would result in career-ending consequences and financial ruin. Victoria had lost everything. Her pension was frozen and partially liquidated to pay legal fees and settlement costs. Her lifetime flight benefits were revoked. Her FAA certification was permanently suspended, making her unemployable in any aviation-related position. Her professional reputation was destroyed so completely that she couldn't find work in customer service, hospitality, or any industry that required interaction with the public. The viral video of her assault on Maya had been viewed over 200 million times across all social media platforms. Her name had become synonymous with workplace discrimination and the kind of entitled prejudice that consumers would no longer tolerate from service industry employees. Victoria's mugshot, taken the night of her arrest, had been used in diversity training programs at companies across the country. Her case was studied in business schools as an example of how personal prejudice could destroy individual careers and expose organizations to massive legal liability. But Maya hadn't been satisfied with individual consequences. She had used Victoria's case as a catalyst for industry-wide transformation that would prevent similar incidents from occurring at other airlines. Working with federal regulators, Maya had helped draft new Department of Transportation guidelines that required all commercial airlines to implement bias detection training, establish clear reporting mechanisms for discrimination complaints, and submit quarterly reports on diversity metrics and customer satisfaction ratings broken down by demographic categories. The Richardson Protocol, as it came to be known throughout the industry, had been adopted by airlines in North America, Europe, and Asia as the new standard for preventing workplace discrimination and ensuring equal treatment of passengers regardless of race appearance or perceived social status. Airlines that failed to meet the new standards faced federal investigations, substantial financial penalties, and potential suspension of their operating certificates. The economic incentives were clear. Discrimination was no longer just morally wrong. It was financially catastrophic for any company that allowed it to persist. The impact extended far beyond the aviation industry. Maya's case had inspired federal legislation that strengthened workplace discrimination protections and increased criminal penalties for assaults motivated by racial bias. The bill, formerly known as the Passenger Protection and Dignity Act, had passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support and been signed into law by the president in a Rose Garden ceremony where Maya had been recognized as a catalyst for meaningful civil rights progress. Corporate America had taken notice. The case had demonstrated that consumers had the power to destroy brands and careers when companies failed to address discrimination and prejudice in their organizations. Social media had amplified the consequences of discriminatory behavior to a scale that made traditional public relations damage control strategies completely ineffective. Companies across every industry had implemented new training programs, revised their hiring practices, and established clear consequences for employees who engaged in discriminatory behavior toward customers or colleagues. The Victoria Hartwell case had become required reading in corporate ethics courses and diversity training programs worldwide. Meanwhile, Marcus Torres had become a symbol of how organizations could identify and promote exceptional talent when they looked beyond traditional hierarchies and seniority processes. His rapid advancement from junior flight attendant to regional director had been documented in business case studies and leadership development programs as an example of merit-based promotion and the value of giving opportunities to employees who demonstrated character and competence. Marcus's success story had inspired other airlines to reevaluate their promotion criteria and create pathways for high-performing employees to advance based on their contributions rather than their tenure or political connections. He had been featured on the cover of Aviation Week magazine and interviewed by major news networks as an example of positive change in the industry. The ripple effects continued to expand. Isabella Martinez, the travel blogger who had captured the assault on video, had used her platform to highlight discrimination in the travel industry and advocate for passenger rights. Her follower count had grown to over 2 million across all platforms, and she had been hired as a correspondent by a major television network to cover travel industry issues and consumer protection stories. Her documentation of the Victoria Hartwell case had been entered into the congressional record during hearings on airline passenger rights, and she had testified before federal regulators about the importance of social media documentation in holding corporations accountable for employee behavior. Roberto Kim, the business executive who had witnessed the discrimination and spoken up for Maya, had been recognized by his own company for demonstrating leadership and moral courage. His willingness to intervene when he saw injustice had been highlighted in corporate communications as an example of the kind of character the company valued in its executives. The transformation was comprehensive, measurable, and sustainable. Customer satisfaction ratings for Apex Airways had reached record levels, with particular improvement in ratings from passengers of color who had previously experienced discrimination or hostile treatment from airline staff. Employee satisfaction had also increased dramatically as workers felt empowered to provide excellent service without fear of retaliation from supervisors who had previously tolerated or encouraged discriminatory behavior. The toxic culture that had infected the organization for years had been replaced by an environment where exceptional service and respect for human dignity were recognized, rewarded, and promoted. Financial performance had followed cultural performance. Apex Airways' stock price had increased by 47% since Maya's acquisition, driven by improved customer loyalty, reduced legal liability, positive media coverage, and investor confidence in the company's sustainable transformation. The airline had become a preferred employer in the aviation industry, attracting top talent from competitors who wanted to work for an organization that aligned with their values and provided opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than politics. Most importantly, the changes had created a model that other organizations could follow. The Richardson Protocol had been adapted by companies in hospitality, retail healthcare, and financial services as a framework for preventing discrimination and creating inclusive environments where all customers and employees were treated with dignity and respect. Maya's transformation of Apex Airways had proven that corporate culture could be changed quickly and permanently when leadership was willing to make difficult decisions and hold people accountable for their actions. The success story had become a template for other executives who wanted to create meaningful change in their own organizations. As Maya concluded her keynote address in the Chicago ballroom, she looked out at an audience that represented the future of the aviation industry. More diverse, more accountable, and more committed to treating every passenger as a valued customer regardless of their appearance or background. The woman who had been slapped for requesting a glass of water had transformed an entire industry through her response to injustice. Her legacy wasn't revenge or punishment, but the creation of opportunities for thousands of people who would never face the kind of discrimination that had once been considered normal and acceptable in commercial aviation. 3 years later, Maya Richardson stood alone in her corner office on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower, looking out at the Chicago skyline as winter snow fell softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The office was elegant but understated, decorated with awards for corporate leadership, framed letters from passengers whose lives had been changed by her transformation of Apex Airways, and a single photograph that held special meaning. Marcus Torres shaking hands with the Secretary of Transportation after being appointed to the Federal Aviation Administration's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board. On her mahogany desk lay a letter that had arrived that morning, handwritten on pink stationery in the careful script of a 12-year-old girl. Maya picked up the letter and read it again, feeling the same emotional impact that had brought tears to her eyes when she first opened it an hour earlier. "Dear Dr. Richardson," the letter began. "My name is Zara Williams, and I am in 7th grade in Detroit, Michigan. My mom showed me the video of what happened to you on the airplane and told me about how you changed everything after that mean lady hurt you. I wanted to tell you that I have been saving money from my allowance and my birthday gifts because I want to be a pilot when I grow up. Before I learned about you, some people told me that black girls don't become pilots and that airlines don't hire people who look like me. But when I saw how you owned a whole airline company and how you made sure everyone gets treated fairly, I knew that I could do it too. I started taking math tutoring to get better grades, and I joined the science club at school. My teacher says I am smart enough to study aerospace engineering in college if I keep working hard. I know it will take a long time and cost a lot of money, but I am going to become a pilot, and maybe someday I will fly planes for your airline. Thank you for showing me that people like us belong everywhere, even in first class and even in the cockpit. I hope I get to meet you someday and shake your hand like you shook hands with that nice flight attendant who became a manager. Your biggest fan, Zara Williams, P.S. My mom says you are a hero, but I think you are even better than that. Heroes are made up, but you are real." Maya set the letter down carefully and walked to the window, placing her palm against the cool glass as she looked out at the city where her journey had begun. For the first time since that December evening 3 years ago, she allowed herself to feel the full emotional weight of what had started with a simple request for a glass of water and a slap that had echoed around the world. She thought about Victoria Hartwell, who had lost everything because she couldn't see past the color of someone's skin and the casual nature of their clothing. Maya felt no satisfaction in Victoria's destruction, only sadness that prejudice had been allowed to flourish unchecked until it consumed someone's entire life in a single moment of violence and hatred. But Maya had learned something important about the nature of justice and transformation. Real change didn't come from punishment or revenge. It came from creating opportunities for people like Zara Williams, for young professionals like Marcus Torres, for travelers who deserve to be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or background. Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, who was now serving his second term on the FAA's advisory board, while also completing his MBA in aviation management. The message was brief but filled with excitement. Dr. Richardson just finished reviewing applications for this year's Richardson Foundation scholarships. We have 847 applicants from underrepresented communities who want to pursue careers in aviation. The future of this industry is going to be amazing. The Richardson Foundation had been established with Maya's personal funds and ongoing contributions from Apex Airways record profits. It provided full scholarships for college students from underrepresented backgrounds who wanted to study aerospace engineering, aviation management, or pursue pilot training. In 3 years, the foundation had supported over 200 students who were now working throughout the aviation industry as pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, and airline executives. Maya smiled, thinking about how a 12-year-old girl in Detroit was saving her allowance to pursue a dream that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The foundation had created pathways for hundreds of young people like Zara to see themselves in careers that had previously been dominated by people who looked nothing like them. Her phone rang, interrupting her reflection. The caller ID showed Isabella Martinez, the travel blogger who had captured the original incident and had since become one of Maya's closest friends and most trusted advisors on customer experience and social media strategy. Maya Isabella said as soon as she answered, "You need to see what's trending on Twitter right now." Someone posted a video of Marcus conducting a training session for new flight attendants, and it's going viral for all the right reasons. Maya opened her laptop and navigated to the social media platform where she found a video that had been viewed over 5 million times in the past 6 hours. The footage showed Marcus standing in front of a diverse group of new Apex Airways employees, his voice clear and confident as he shared the story of that December evening and its aftermath. "The most important thing I learned that night," Marcus was saying to the trainees, "is that exceptional service isn't about the passengers' clothes, their accent, or what they look like. It's about recognizing that every single person who steps onto our aircraft deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. When we see someone being discriminated against, we have a choice. We can look the other way and allow injustice to continue, or we can speak up and do what's right even when it's difficult." The comments section was filled with responses from airline employees, passengers, and industry professionals who had been inspired by Marcus's message and Apex Airways' transformation. People were sharing their own stories of discrimination in travel, celebrating the changes that had occurred across the industry, and expressing gratitude for leadership that had chosen principle over profit. Maya closed the laptop and returned to her position by the window, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with stock prices or profit margins. She had used her wealth and power to create something larger than a successful business. She had created a movement that valued human dignity over arbitrary hierarchies and corporate profits. A soft knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Maya turned to see her executive assistant, Nia Thompson, holding a folder of documents that required her signature. "Dr. Richardson," Nia said, "the final reports from the Federal Aviation Administration are ready for your review. They're officially recommending that the Richardson Protocol be adopted as mandatory federal regulation for all commercial airlines operating in the United States." Maya took the folder, but instead of opening it immediately, she looked at Nia with a question that had been forming in her mind throughout the afternoon. "Nia," she said, "do you think we did the right thing? Not just with Victoria Hartwell, but with everything that followed." Nia considered the question carefully before responding, understanding that her boss was asking about something deeper than corporate strategy or financial performance. "Dr. Richardson," Nia replied 3 years ago, "passengers who looked like you and me expected to be treated poorly when they traveled. They dressed up for flights, not because they wanted to look nice, but because they were afraid that casual clothing would be used as an excuse to discriminate against them. Children like that little girl in Detroit never imagined they could become pilots because they never saw people who looked like them in cockpits or boardrooms. Nia gestured toward the window where they could see aircraft from multiple airlines approaching O'Hare Airport in the distance. Today, every single one of those planes is operated by companies that have implemented bias training diversity requirements and customer protection policies that didn't exist before you decided to turn a moment of injustice into a catalyst for industry transformation. Thousands of employees have jobs they never would have had. Millions of passengers travel with dignity they never would have experienced. Nia paused, her voice taking on a tone of deep respect and gratitude. You didn't just change an airline, Dr. Richardson. You changed an entire industry's understanding of what customer service means and who deserves to be treated with respect. That little girl in Detroit is saving her allowance to become a pilot because you showed her that her dreams are possible. Maya nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with the power to create meaningful change in the world. She thought about all the people whose lives had been affected by the decisions she had made in response to Victoria Hartwell's assault, the employees who had been promoted based on merit rather than politics, the passengers who no longer faced discrimination when they traveled, the young people who could now see themselves in careers that had previously been closed to them. As the winter afternoon faded into evening, Maya picked up Zara Williams' letter one more time. She walked to her desk, pulled out a piece of personal stationery, and began writing a response that would encourage a 12-year-old girl to continue pursuing her dreams of becoming a pilot. Dear Zara, she wrote, "Thank you for your beautiful letter and for sharing your dreams with me. You are absolutely right that people like us belong everywhere, including in the cockpit and the boardroom. I would be honored to meet you someday, and I hope that when you achieve your goal of becoming a pilot, you will remember that your success opens doors for other young people who need to see that their dreams are possible too." Maya sealed the letter in an envelope and handed it to Nia to mail along with information about the Richardson Foundation's scholarship programs and an invitation for Zara to visit Apex Airways headquarters when she was ready to begin her aviation studies. 3 years after a flight attendant had slapped her for requesting a glass of water, Maya Richardson had built something far more valuable than a successful business. She had created a legacy of opportunity, dignity, and justice that would continue long after her own career had ended. The woman who had been told she didn't belong in first class had not only reclaimed her seat, she had redefined what first-class service meant for everyone who would travel after her. Her response to injustice had become a blueprint for transformation that would inspire leaders across every industry to choose courage over convenience and character over profit. Sometimes Maya reflected as she prepared to leave her office, the most powerful changes begin with the simplest acts of standing up for what's right, especially when it's difficult. She had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in stock prices or corporate acquisitions, but in the lives that were improved and the opportunities that were created for people who had been told they didn't belong. As she gathered her coat and briefcase, Maya's phone chimed with one final message of the day. It was from Marcus Torres. "Dr. Richardson just wanted you to know that Zara Williams from Detroit is one of the scholarship applicants I mentioned earlier. Her essay about wanting to become a pilot was one of the best I've ever read. I think you're going to love meeting her." Maya smiled and walked toward the elevator, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to continue the work of creating a world where everyone could pursue their dreams without fear of discrimination or prejudice. The transformation that had begun with a slap had become a movement that would outlast them all. If you've witnessed bias in your workplace, on a flight, or anywhere, your dignity was questioned, your story matters. Share it below. Because when we speak up, we don't just defend ourselves, we build protection for everyone who comes after us. Sometimes, justice wears sweatpants and carries a laptop. Sometimes, the person you underestimate owns everything you think you control. If this story of corporate karma and transformation inspired you, make sure you hit that like button right now. What would you have done if you were in Maya's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to see that dignity isn't negotiable and that standing up for what's right can change entire industries. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because stories like this remind us that real change is possible when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination is building a better world for everyone who comes after you.